Have you ever given something away, not because you had enough, but because someone else had even less? Not a grand gesture. Just a quiet decision. One that no one saw, but that somehow never left your heart. There's a story, buried in the mud and silence of an old battlefield, that still lingers in the memory of a few men who were there. They say it happened on the third night. Cold. Wet. Rations were low. Spirits were lower. But in the middle of all that, something small happened. Something no one expected. The trench was narrow, carved into the hillside like a wound the earth didn't want. Rain had turned everything to sludge. Boots sank with each step. They'd been out there for days, cut off, low on supplies. Every man had counted what he had left down to the crumb. And he had one ration left. One. He sat alone that night, away from the others. Maybe he needed the quiet. Maybe he just didn't want them to see the hunger in his eyes. No one remembers his name right away. He wasn't the loud one. Not the one with jokes or stories. But they all remember what he did. Because just before dawn, through the folds of mist and wire, something moved. Not a soldier. Not a threat. A child. Thin. Barefoot. Covered in dirt. No words were spoken. Only eyes met. And then he did something simple. Something foolish, maybe. He unwrapped that last bit of food. Held it out. And waited. That was it. No music. No hero speech. No witnesses, except a child too hungry to say thank you. But years later, the ones who made it home, they still talk about that moment. Not because it won a war. But because, for 1 second, it reminded them what kind of men they hoped they could be. He didn't talk much. In fact, most of the men couldn't remember the last time he'd said more than a few words strung together. But no one mistook his silence for weakness. There was something steady about him. The way he carried his pack, checked on the wounded without waiting to be asked, or stayed behind just a little longer during fire watch. No complaints. No need for praise. The guys in the squad had all kinds of nicknames for each other. Jokes, mostly. But him? They just called him Doc, even though he wasn't a medic. Because he's the one who always fixes things, Corporal Henley had once said. Even when nobody's looking. When rations started running low, the griping came easy for everyone else. You'd hear it in the trench. This all we get today? I'd trade my boots for a hot cup of anything. But not from him. One night, as they sat around a flickering heater made from a broken ammo box, someone passed him a piece of bread, half of what little they had left. He looked at it for a moment, then quietly passed it to the youngest guy on the team, Patterson. Just 19. First deployment. Still jumped every time the wind changed. Patterson blinked. You sure? He nodded. I had mine earlier, he said. But everyone knew he hadn't. He didn't do it for thanks. He never even waited to see if Patterson took a bite. Just got up and walked to the edge of the trench, where he'd sit alone with a journal no one ever saw him write in. It wasn't what he said. It was how he showed up, quietly, consistently. And somehow, that kind of presence, it made more noise than all the shouting ever could. By the start of day 4, the rain had seeped into everything, socks, gear, even the seams of their thoughts. No letters from home. No updates from command. Just cold silence, broken by the occasional crackle of static on the radio, and the gnawing reminder that supplies were nearly gone. Each man had exactly one ration left. They'd counted them out the night before, torn packaging laid side by side like sacred relics. No one said the word hunger out loud anymore. It was too close, too personal. Doc sat at the edge of the trench, legs drawn up, the brown ration pack resting on his lap like a quiet burden. He hadn't touched it since they'd been handed out. Every now and then, he'd run a thumb across the plastic seal. Not opening it. Just feeling it. As if he was still deciding whether it truly belonged to him. Corporal Henley had noticed. "You waitin' on room service?" he muttered, trying to lighten the air. Doc didn't look up. Just gave a small shake of his head. Not annoyed. Just, there. Henley sighed. "Look, man. Eat. You don't have to be a hero." Still, nothing. That night, the air shifted. Quiet, but not right. Patterson, doing perimeter check, was the first to notice. A sound. Faint, but there. Like gravel scraping bone. They found him crouched near the back end of the trench, halfway under a sheet of canvas. A child. Couldn't have been more than 8. Mud caked around his legs. Shirt torn. Lips dry and split from the cold. He didn't speak. Just looked at them. Wide-eyed. Hollow. Henley cursed under his breath. Where the hell did he come from? No one moved at first. This wasn't in the manual. Weren't they told the village had been evacuated? Doc stepped forward, slow, calm. He knelt, keeping his voice low. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe now." The boy didn't answer. That's when Doc pulled the ration pack from his coat. The same one he'd been carrying for 3 days. He opened it slowly, hands steady, and broke the contents into smaller pieces. Crackers. A bit of processed meat. He offered them without a word, crouching low, his body between the child and the wind. The rest of the squad watched, quiet. Patterson whispered, "That's all he had left." Henley didn't say anything. He just turned away and stared out at the trees. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was something else. Later, Doc didn't explain. He never did. He just returned to his spot, sat down with empty hands and eyes that held something more than tiredness. There was still no word from command. Still no backup. But in that trench, with nothing left to eat and even less to hope for, they saw something that didn't need orders or medals to matter. They saw the kind of strength that doesn't shout. The kind that gives everything, and expects nothing in return. By the next morning, the boy was still there, curled into a bundle of wool blankets someone had given up. His eyes barely opened. He didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just breathed shallow, like it was too much work to even ask for help. The squad hadn't received orders in almost 2 days. The radio was dead. Batteries had drowned in the rain. Nobody said it, but they all knew the supply line wasn't coming anytime soon. Doc moved differently that morning. Slower. But focused. He took time boiling what was left of their water rations, making sure the boy had something warm to sip. Then he sat down, unwrapped the final corner of his ration, a sliver of bread he'd tucked into his coat the night before. It was barely more than a crust. But he warmed it between his hands before offering it. The boy stared at it, not moving. His eyes shifted toward the other soldiers, then back to Doc. Doc didn't say anything. Just extended his hand. The boy took it, finally, with fingers stiff and trembling. He held it like it was something sacred. And maybe, in a place like that, it was. Henley watched from a distance, arms crossed. "That was your last one," he said quietly, as Doc sat back down beside the trench wall. Doc didn't answer right away. "I figured he needed it more." "You haven't eaten in 2 days," Henley muttered. Doc shrugged. 3. There was no pride in his voice. No performance. Just fact. Patterson sat nearby, fiddling with a button on his coat. His voice cracked a little when he asked, "What if we're out here another week?" Doc didn't meet his eyes. "Then we'll figure something out." That night, as the squad bedded down in rotations, the boy finally spoke. Just a whisper. "Why?" Doc looked up from his corner, his back against the dirt wall. He blinked. Then nodded, like he understood the question wasn't about bread. "Because I could," he said softly. The boy didn't reply. Just pulled the blanket tighter around himself, eyes watching Doc until sleep won. And somewhere in the silence of that trench, a quiet kind of weight settled. It wasn't sorrow. Not quite. It was something deeper. A knowing. That one man, tired, hungry, half-frozen, had chosen kindness when there was nothing left to give. He hadn't waited for the cameras or the medals. He hadn't made a speech or asked for backup. He just gave. The next morning, the bread was gone. The boy was still alive. And Doc, he looked thinner, a little slower to stand. But he didn't complain. He never did. Henley left a note in the squad log, something brief. Just one line, written in the corner in pencil. He gave the last of it. And somehow, that made us all feel full. They'd seen plenty of tough men out there. Men with scars, tempers, stories they'd never tell. But Doc? He never raised his voice. Never asked for credit. And yet, in that moment, in the act of handing over the last bite of hope, he became the strongest man they knew. Not because he fought harder. But because he gave quietly, fully, and without needing to be seen. That meal was never recorded in any official report. But the ones who watched it happen, they remembered. The rain didn't let up. It came in sheets, slicing through the cold and settling deep in their bones. The trench was no longer just wet, it was soaked. Mud sucked at their boots. Socks never dried. The fire they'd built with scrap wood had burned out 2 nights ago, and there was nothing left to burn. 3 more days passed. No supplies. No orders. No rescue. And no food. What little anyone had left had been gone by the second morning. A few tried chewing coffee grounds just to have something in their mouths. Others stayed quiet, preserving energy, their movements slower now, careful, deliberate. Doc moved less. He still woke with the others, still checked on Patterson's infected toe, still handed off water rations like he wasn't keeping track. But the weight in his steps showed. So did the hollow in his cheeks. Patterson noticed. "You okay?" he asked one morning, voice hoarse and uncertain. Doc gave a nod. "Fine." But when he stood, his hand reached for the wall of the trench, steadying himself just long enough for Patterson to realize that maybe he wasn't fine. "Not really." Henley pulled Patterson aside later that day. "He's not eating. You know that, right? He gave it all away." "Yeah. I know." The silence hung between them. "You think he'll be all right?" Henley didn't answer. That evening, Doc sat with his back to the trench wall, staring out at the gray sky. The boy was asleep beside him, head resting on a folded jacket. No words. Just a rhythm of shallow breaths and stillness. When Patterson brought over a scrap of boiled cloth meant to feel like tea, Doc didn't drink it. Just nodded his thanks and handed it to the boy without a word. By the third day, Doc's voice had grown quieter. His hands trembled when tying a bandage. And once, when no one was watching, he sat down mid-step, resting like the air had grown heavier than he could lift. But he didn't ask for help. He never complained. That night, when a weak signal finally crackled through the backup radio, the squad was told supplies would arrive in 48 hours. Just 2 more days. The mood should have lifted. But Henley glanced at Doc, eyes half shut, lips pale, body hunched forward like a man twice his age, and knew 2 days might be too long. He squatted beside him. "You hear that?" he asked softly. "We've got help coming." Doc blinked. "Yeah. I heard. You hang in there, all right?" Doc didn't reply. He just looked toward the boy, still curled under the same blanket, and managed the faintest smile. "I already did what I came here to do," he whispered. Henley didn't push him. Some things, he knew, weren't meant to be argued with. In the trench that night, no one slept easy. Not because of gunfire. Not because of fear. But because they were starting to realize that sometimes the greatest battles were fought quietly, inside a man's own body, and he never told anyone he was bleeding. 2 weeks after they got pulled out, the squad was back at base, clean uniforms, dry boots, and food that didn't come out of a vacuum-sealed pouch. But something in them stayed damp, like the cold from that trench had followed them home. Doc had made it through. Barely. He collapsed the morning after the airlift, right there on the tarmac, eyes open but body too empty to carry him any farther. The medics said it was starvation mixed with dehydration. Said he should have spoken up. Said he was lucky. But luck had nothing to do with it. Everyone knew that. They kept in touch, most of the guys. A few letters here and there. Henley eventually got a job fixing HVAC units in Kentucky. Patterson went back to school. And Doc, well, no one really knew where he went. He didn't talk much. Never did. Just faded quietly, like fog after dawn. Then, a few years later, Henley got a letter. No return address. Just a worn envelope, the kind that had traveled too far and passed through too many hands. Inside was a photo. Black and white. Slightly blurred. A young man standing in front of a small stone building, holding a loaf of bread with both hands. Smiling. The note was written in careful English. I was the boy. He gave me food. I remember his eyes. I didn't know how to thank him. I think I do now. I feed others. No name. Just that. Henley stared at it for a long time. He turned the photo over, checked for clues. There was nothing else. But it didn't matter. He knew what it meant. He called Patterson that night. You remember that kid? Henley asked. The one in the trench? Yeah. He found a way to say thank you. Patterson didn't say much after that. Just let the silence speak. Later, Henley pinned the photo to the wall above his workbench. Right next to the squad picture. The two sat side by side. One showing the men who made it through. The other showing a life that existed because of it. It wasn't a newspaper headline. It didn't end with applause or flags. But it meant something. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, one boy, once starved, once silent, had grown up to carry something forward. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just bread. And somehow, in a way none of them could explain, that small act made the sacrifice feel whole. Doc never asked for a legacy. But he left one anyway. Henley never framed medals. He didn't keep his uniform pressed or his boots polished like some of the others. But that photo, the one with the boy holding bread, he kept that close. On the wall above his bench, next to an old rusted canteen and a folded flag he didn't talk much about. Some mornings, he'd look at it before heading out the door. Not out of habit. Out of something quieter. A pull. One day, a young tech came into the shop, fresh out of trade school. Saw the picture. Asked casually, your kid? Henley just shook his head. No, he said. But someone's reason to stay alive. He didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. A few weeks later, a man from the VA stopped by. Said they were gathering stories. Personal accounts from veterans, ones that never made the history books. Stories that lived in notebooks, in silences, in the space between meals and mortar shells. Henley agreed to talk. But only on one condition. I'll tell you about the quiet ones, he said. The ones who never asked to be remembered. And he did. He told them about Patterson, scared but brave. About the trench, the rain, the waiting. And about Doc, who had no first name anyone could recall, just that nickname that stuck. But what he remembered most was the moment the boy took that bread. Held it in both hands like it was something holy. And then the words, simple, soft, said years later in a letter. The bread was still warm. Henley paused when he said that out loud. Let the words settle. Because that's what stayed with him. Not the mud. Not the hunger. But that line. The bread was still warm. It meant Doc hadn't just handed off a meal. He'd given something that still carried life. Heat. presents. He hadn't given leftovers. He'd given the best of what he had, while he still had it. That's what real giving is, Henley said quietly. You don't wait till it's safe. Or easy. You do it when it costs. The interviewer asked if he thought that act changed anything. Henley didn't answer right away. Then he looked up. Voice steady. It saved a boy. And it reminded a bunch of starving men what it meant to be human. He didn't say more after that. Didn't need to. Some stories don't grow louder with retelling. They just echo a little longer. And that warmth, that quiet, flickering warmth of bread in a boy's hands, never really left them. His name was never in the papers. There was no headline. No photograph beneath bold letters. No parade. No folded flag handed to a grieving family. Because Doc didn't die in the war, and he didn't save a general or storm a hill. What he did was smaller. Quieter. And maybe that's why it lasted longer. After the war, most of the guys went home and tried to forget pieces of it. Some succeeded. Some didn't. Henley said it was like carrying a box you couldn't set down, but if you held it the right way, maybe you could keep walking. Doc never showed up to reunions. Never sent a return address. But once a year, always on the same date, something arrived at the VA hospital where Henley volunteered. A loaf of bread. Still warm. No card. No message. Just the bread. Wrapped carefully in a brown cloth. The first time it came, they thought it was a mistake. A donation or a mix-up from the kitchen. But the second year, it came again. And the third. And by the fourth, Henley understood. He didn't know where it came from, or who baked it. He didn't ask. Some truths didn't need names. It became tradition. Every November, he'd place the loaf on a small table in the community room. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a chair beside it, empty, and an old photo of the squad tucked underneath. Sometimes the veterans who gathered would ask what it meant. Henley would smile a little and say, it's a reminder. That you don't have to be remembered by everyone to have made a difference. Patterson, who now had kids of his own, once brought his son in. Showed him the loaf. Told him the story, not the whole thing, just the heart of it. There was a man, he said, who gave everything he had, and asked for nothing back. The boy looked confused. Why? Because someone needed it more, Patterson replied. And because kindness doesn't wait for permission. In that room, with its scuffed floors and second-hand chairs, the warmth of that bread filled more than just air. It filled silence. It filled memory. It filled all the places where pain once lived and now made room for something else, dignity. Doc never wore his medals. No one could even confirm if he'd accepted them. But that act, that single gesture, the last meal he never ate, spoke louder than any ceremony. Not every hero is carved in stone. Some are remembered through small rituals. Through quiet loaves of bread. Through the steady hands of old men who refuse to forget what grace looks like when it goes unnoticed. Henley passed away 10 years later. Patterson took his place at the VA, and when November came around, he made sure the table was set. Chair in place. Photo upright. And when the loaf arrived, still warm, just like always, he sat for a moment. Didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Some stories end not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. And so the bread stayed warm. The memory stayed whole. And the name that was never in the papers lived on, in the hearts of those who knew what it truly meant to give. In a world that often celebrates loud victories and public praise, Doc's story reminds us of a quieter kind of heroism, the kind that lives in silence, gives without fanfare, and endures through small, selfless acts. He never asked for recognition. He never stood in front of cameras. But he gave the last of what he had, his only meal, to a starving child in a muddy trench. That single, quiet gesture didn't just save a life. It lit a fire that would be passed forward, loaf by loaf, year after year. And though his name never appeared in the headlines, his legacy lived on, through Henley, through Patterson, and through a loaf of warm bread that kept showing up, even after he was gone. That's the kind of story we tell here on Legacy of Courage Stories, not the ones written in textbooks, but the ones etched in character, kindness, and quiet dignity. Have you ever witnessed an act of quiet courage? One that changed everything without saying a word? If this story moved you, please like, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because the world needs more of these quiet reminders, that even in silence, we can leave behind something unforgettable.